know, it's a shame that nobody talks about Afghanistan anymore, considering how the war is far from over and remains the longest military quagmire in U.S. history. At this point, we should be asking ourselves a very important question. Bin Laden's dead and Afghanistan's apparently ready to police themselves, so why are we still there? See, aside from U.S. troops still occupying the country, there are over 100,000 private contractors in Afghanistan. And guess what? The Pentagon can't even tell us what the hell they're doing there. But this right here might give you a clue.
It is the most unintended and awkward consequence of our military offensive here in Afghanistan. The rout by our Marines of the Taliban from their former stronghold here in Helmand Province has put us in the weird position of being protectors of the largest crop of opium in the world.
Thanks, Geraldo. And guess what, guys? The Taliban had banned and almost completely eradicated opium in Afghanistan shortly before the U.S. invaded. Just look at these headlines. The corporate media was even lauding the Taliban's success. Fast forward to today, where over 90% of the world's heroin originates from the war-torn country. According to a report from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, this year saw opium production surge to a record high. The report said that the harvest this May resulted in 5,500 metric tons of opium, 49% higher than last year, and more than the combined output of the rest of the world. Wow, that's a lot of heroin and a lot of money being made. Someone's got to be reaping the spoils, which brings us back to war, which has always been about two things: resources and control. As reported by Global Research back in 2005, heroin is a multi-billion-dollar business supported by powerful interests, which requires a steady and secure commodity flow. One of the hidden objectives of the war was precisely to restore the CIA-sponsored drug trade to its historical levels and exert direct control over the drug routes. Of course, according to Geraldo, it's nothing more than an uncomfortable fluke that the U.S. military happens to be guarding the largest opium supply in the world. I guess we're also supposed to believe that this discovery of Afghanistan's $1 trillion worth of untapped minerals was a surprise coincidence. In today's globalized world, one can't discount the role that multinational corporations play in U.S. foreign policy decisions. Not only have oil companies and private military contractors made a killing off the occupation, Big Pharma, which collectively lobbies over $250 million annually to Congress, needs opium latex to manufacture drugs for this pill-happy nation. Don't forget about the banks. See, trillions in black market sales are being funneled through banks, and this money's got to come out clean on the other side. Support for the ongoing war may not be high, but believe me, these corporations are in it for the long haul. See, a strategic pact that will allow a U.S. troop presence to remain in Afghanistan until 2024 has already been signed. So baseless rhetoric and propaganda aside, here's the cold, hard truth. This government is fighting a war on drugs worldwide, with millions of nonviolent drug users rotting away in prison. Yet on the other hand, the U.S. is at the very least nurturing the largest source of the deadliest and most addictive drug on the planet. So you tell me what the occupation of Afghanistan is really about.
There's a new epidemic: smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack.
I remember clearly one day in the late 80s, every single news network simultaneously running an identical news alert about the new, incredible, powerful, unbelievably cheap drug that was to sweep the nation.
This is crack cocaine.
Soon, every single black person living in the ghetto would sell his own mother for another hit of crack cocaine. It was like watching a strategically engineered ad campaign. Talk about perfect product placement. Did we mention it's cheap and strong and very addictive? Only $5 now, so stay away from it.
Let there be no mistake. This stuff is poison.
Crack cocaine epidemic. Crack cocaine epidemic.
There's a great line in the movie Boys in the Hood where Larry Fishburne is saying, hey man, we don't grow it, we don't own any airplanes, we don't have any laboratories. How does it get here? Why does it get here? And that's a very good common sense approach that intuitively the people in South Central understood, that there was something much bigger than them that was moving the whole drug issue and the drug war.
We understand what you're saying. A ton of cocaine was smuggled into the United States of America.
Well,
in cooperation with the CIA?
That's exactly what appears to have happened.
When I was a clandestine case officer, I thought I was doing God's work, the nation's work, by recruiting traitors in varied countries around the world. And what I didn't realize was that I was literally there for show. I was just going through the motions because the traitors weren't producing really useful information. We were ignoring all of the openly available information that would have produced much richer results. Let's jump over to General Manuel Noriega in Panama. General Noriega was told by Bill Casey, then director of the Central Intelligence Agency, that he could have a free run with drugs into America, provided that he allowed us to support the Contras from Panama. That was a straight-up deal.
Now, we all know that the U.S. government and the CIA supported the Contras in their efforts to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the middle 80s. Now, it is alleged the CIA also helped the Contras raise money for arms by introducing crack cocaine into California.
Deutsch felt he had to do something to try to deal with the outrage that was foaming all over the country at the time. And of course, it just blew up in his face.
CIA fights drugs. CIA does not encourage drugs.
I mean, it was actually one of the most monumental blunders of all time, if you think about it.
We have no evidence of a conspiracy by the CIA to engage in encouraging drug traffickers in Nicaragua or elsewhere in Latin America.
Deutsch was there because of the Gary Webb stories. The Gary Webb stories had sparked a national furor.
I am a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, and I work South Central Los Angeles, and I will tell you, Director Deutsch, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time.
And I was able to name operations.
Director Deutsch, I will refer you to 3 specific agency operations known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. I have Watchtower documents heavily redacted by the agency. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country.
He stumbled and stammered and wrung his hands.
If you have information about CIA illegal activity in drugs, you should immediately bring that information to wherever you want, but let me suggest 3 places. The Los Angeles Police Department.
And of course my response was, I started there 18 years ago, sir, and they tried to kill me. Now what do you want me to do?
If this information turns up wrongdoing, we will bring the people to justice and make them accountable.
If you're familiar with the book called Dark Alliance, written about the CIA bringing in cocaine into South Central LA, the whole Ricky Ross story.
Well, you know, I've been working with the CIA for years. I take great pride in what they do. They're very disciplined people of great courage. There aren't many of them. It's a very small agency. They're out there in the global context trying to protect the American people. So I think they deserve to be treated with respect. But the notion that they're smuggling drugs into America is just absurd.
General McCaffrey, Alex Jones from KJFK Radio in Austin, Texas. I fully agree with you on the scourge of narcotics and their destructive consequences on the human brain. But something I find interesting is the massive evidence coming out in the past of our own government and other international organizations' involvement in drug smuggling. In fact, 2 days ago, you called Colombia an emergency situation, and you're calling for $1 billion in more funding. Well, your head of counter-narcotics and drug operations in Colombia, his wife was just caught shipping in masses of cocaine into the United States. This is from the Washington Post, sir. Also have Reuters right here on it.
Is there a question?
Yes, that's my question. I just wanted to state my facts because, you know, we're in this world where you ask a serious question, you're a kook. Let's talk about the drug running of this government.
I was invited a few years ago when General McCaffrey was the drug czar to be involved in a debate. He bragged with a smile on his face that the budget for his office, namely the Office of National Drug Control Policy, was getting an increase in funding from $17 billion per year to something like $18.5 billion per year. Can you imagine how much money that is?
You go to children and you say, do you remember your mom, dad, coach, teacher saying marijuana is unacceptable? If I remember hearing that, I'm not using drugs. You know, we have actually done a terrific job in the United States reducing drug abuse. It's down from 14% of the population past month to 7%.
And if you expect somebody that controls that much money to be in favor of change, look again. Of course not, because money is power.
Our problem isn't that we use too many drugs. Our problem is we've got too much money.
Most people today cannot even tell you the name of our current drug czar who works under the Bush administration.
We want to expand drug treatment courts that find people who are in trouble with the law because of their addiction and give them an opportunity to not just to pay their debt to society, but to get clean and sober.
Our viewpoint and our funding was to enhance prevention and education.
On all of the drug czars since McCaffrey, or since Bill Bennett, who was the first one under these circumstances, they all do the same thing, they all talk the same way, they all give lip service to drug treatment, but when it comes down to it and the rubber meets the road, the only money that is spent is for incarceration.
The reason why we don't hear about the drug czar, and by the way, the drug czar is the son of General Vernon Walters, who was a great CIA hand during Iran-Contra, a great CIA player. John Walters is his name. We don't hear about it now because the drug business is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The drug money is flowing, people are going to jail, the money's going through Wall Street, people are happy, it's not out of control, and everybody's looking the other way. And that's exactly the way they need it to be because they cannot sustain not only the U.S. economy, but they cannot sustain the U.S. empire, the American empire, without those drug flows.
The amount of heroin reaching U.S. shores seems to come in cycles, but nothing in past history can compare to the influx experienced in the wake of the new war on terror.
It's very important for the American taxpayer to understand that Afghanistan was producing virtually no heroin under the Taliban and is now responsible for 80% of the heroin coming to the United States and the Western countries.
Now, we invaded Afghanistan right after 9/11, secured the country in November. Just by coincidence, the planting season for the opium poppy is November, and you harvest in late May and early June.
Former DEA agent Celerino Castillo served in the DEA, where he helped to eradicate vast poppy fields.
When the Taliban was in Afghanistan, they were what they were, but they were definitely against opium crops cultivation, and a lot of it was destroyed.
We secured the country just in time to release a whole bunch of opium warlords from prison. It was in the news.
Well, drug money could soon be funding Al-Qaeda and other terror groups. These beautiful-looking flowers are fueling some ugly addiction and terrorism.
When you've taught everybody how to make money with hard drugs, what are they supposed to do? Stop?
Police don't bother them. The U.S. military has other priorities.
So within this past year that the U.S. government has control of Afghanistan, why is there a major crop of heroin that's going to be coming into the U.S. or has come into the U.S.?
If you quit drugs, you join the fight against terror in America.
When you have a government that promotes drugs to get their agendas across in Central America and South America, in Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia, and then puts its own people in jail for using them, are you really living in a free country?
I've had two sitting congressmen tell me this. Jim, you're right. Most people in Washington realize that the war on drugs is not winnable, but it's eminently fundable, and people in government bureaucracy are addicted to the drug war funding.
What then is the role of the IMF? It seems to me that the taxpayers' money goes to the IMF, they give it to the third world country, which in turn turns it back over to the banks. It looks like a
lot of it just goes directly from the taxpayers directed to the bank. It never goes to the third world. It's all by computer. But that was a few years back. I guess it was '83. There was an IMF bailout. They were in financial trouble, and it was $9 billion. most of that money was necessary to pay interest, you know, just to the big banks. That's why the Panama Canal Treaty existed. It was a banking deal too. It was Panama was having trouble making their payments to the banks, and they needed a better cash flow. The Canal Treaty occurred. They had more income. Now their little old Noriega isn't quite so obedient, and they're a little bit annoyed by it all. But you know, Trujillo's and then Noriega were really the hand-picked people from our business banking industry. They had a banking haven down there, but now Noriega isn't quite so obedient. It's making the bankers a little nervous. They'd like to get rid of him, and so far they haven't been able to. And I think one of the reasons is he has a lot of information that he is threatened with, and they said, if you ever get too close to us, we're going to let the world know exactly how you've been dealing with us and subsidizing our drug trade. So I think he's doing a little blackmailing.
People who've studied the drug trade say that if were it not for the collusion and facilitation and laundering of money by the big banks, the drug trade wouldn't be able to operate.
They'd have a great deal of difficulty because they literally end up buying some of these banks, and they own the banks, and they do you know, filter their money through. Now there's a great pretense that there's going to be a lot of crackdown on all these drug dealers and this money coming into that, and they're going to find out who it is. But I think that's basically designed to use as an excuse, develop this hysteria against drugs so that they have currency controls on whom? On American citizens who finally wise up and they say, hey, I can't preserve my wealth in this country. I'm going to put a couple Krugerrands over in the Swiss banks. So they try to take everybody, when near the time of runaway inflation, people want to take the money out of the country to preserve their wealth. And that's why they're writing all these laws, not to catch the drug dealers. I think that's just a front. I think the real reason is to have currency controls on the American citizens, because once a large number of citizens decide to leave, just think of how many people in Mexico tried to come here when their banking crisis occurred. You know, the government clamped down. You can't take the money out. They still did. But we had those, we had credit controls in the 1970s, currency controls, trying to keep people. Britain had them on, off and on, and they always resort to those kind of things. So we can anticipate it, but I think that's one of the purposes of the big drug issue, is order to write these laws so that they control innocent American people who would like to preserve their wealth.
But they could do away with the dope trade pretty fast if they really clamp down on the big banks, but they're the head people in the power structure.
That's right, but they're not likely to do that.
John, you've taken a look at foreign investment in the United States. Some of those statistics, haven't you?
It's startling when you look at it all in one lump sum. Ron, you're from Houston, and there was a story recently about Houston, prime real estate there being about 36% foreign-owned. That occurred in USA Today, a front-page story. Prime real estate in Los Angeles, 49%, 46%, something like that, foreign-owned. We're seeing investments every day, banks being bought, commercial properties, farmland. And the article that I saw, there was a study released last month on it, that it's the foreign investment total in the United States now is in excess of $1.3 trillion and growing at a tremendous rate. We call it the liquidation sale of America. Why is it happening?
There are several reasons why it's happening, but I think a lot of those investments are made by Japanese investors. I think it's rather interesting to note that we had to fight a war not too many years ago with Japan. We thought we won the war, and now they own not only a lot of Houston and Los Angeles, they own Waikiki Beach. They won, due to our bad policy, what they couldn't win in war. The main reason is it's our sick currency. We have a balance of trade problem, but we compound it by literally exporting a lot of our money through foreign aid and military aid. So even Japan gets a benefit of about $50 billion a year by us paying for all their national defense. So we sort of subsidize them, and because we're less competitive and our interest rates are high, our interest rates 8 and 9%, in Japan they're 2 and 3%. Labor costs are lower, so we can't compete anymore, and that's why we keep buying Japanese products. A lot of people say, well, the only solution is to write a law and say that Americans can't buy a Japanese car and no foreign investors allowed to invest in this country. We as libertarians don't accept that. It's treating the symptom rather than the disease. The disease is a foreign policy where we subsidize these rich allies. At the same time, we have a currency that's weak and we have economic conditions that have made us non-competitive. We don't want to take away the right of the individual to buy whatever product he wants, and we don't want to start some type of walling off of our country and saying nobody can come and go and people can't come in. I want a right to go out of the country and invest, and that means we have to allow somebody else to come in here and invest. So our solution is free markets, sound money, low interest rates, competitiveness, free market prices in labor, quit subsidizing Japan, a different foreign policy. Then I don't think we'd have to worry. We never had to worry about the foreigners buying up this country until recent times, until we got into these economic problems.
But it's curious, the people who say we shouldn't keep financing the defense of Western Europe and Japan, and yet it's those people who are buying American securities and financing our deficits. So they are
the foreigners?
Yeah, so they are indirectly paying for their own defense.
You know, there's some truth to that, and I think there's been a deal too. I think that sometimes they're buying our debt when it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But you have to think about, again, of this internationalism. They do this in order to maintain their order for their benefit. So even if it isn't to Japan's central bank's interest, you know, to buy our securities for a strict economic, they might be able to buy somebody else's security and make more money. They might be able to buy a Swiss security. It might be a better deal. But if it's best for order in their eyes, I think, yes, they will. And indirectly, that is the case. So I think long term, we can't pay this debt. So if we owe Japan $1 trillion, if they bought $1 trillion worth of our treasury bills, I think they're going to be left holding the bag. And that's when I think the panic's going to come. When it finally dawns on them that they're holding a lot of lousy debt and they quit buying our debt, that'll be the precipitating event for the crisis. And that's when then the cartel, you know, this is a cartel of central banks, and they're working pretty well together, and there's a lot of power there. But I think they'll finally break up their little cartel, and they'll get a little bit antsy, and they won't buy our debt, and then the panic will start.
Isn't there a potential problem with the buying up of so much U.S. industry and banks and land? And that is, it's with ownership comes control and power. So are we, through letting them do this, actually giving the Japanese more and more power over our economic and political system?
That's why we should change our policy. That's why we should have sound money. I think it's very dangerous because we literally will lose control. And that's why I think it's urgent that we look to balancing a budget as quickly as possible and restoring sound money and changing our foreign policy. But if we're concerned, which I think everybody is, I don't think anybody is unconcerned. I think some people come up with different solutions, but I want to not deal with it in the narrow sense or probably writing some little rigid rule and say, well, I can solve this if we just keep Japan's cars out of here. We're going to solve our problem. It's not that easy. I mean, we have to look at the big picture of the economy, the monetary system, the deficits, the whole thing put together in order to solve it. It means it's not easy.
Well, thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you.
And your background and insight. And we all got to look for some place to go when that big crash occurs. I don't know where it's going to be, but
we got to prepare ourselves.
Maybe we all got to start studying Japanese.
Hopefully not.
This is the same Air Force that was established and trained by the U.S. military and paid for with U.S. tax dollars.
Yeah, quite a story. Connor Powell is streaming live on this from Kabul, Afghanistan for us.
Martha, the U.S. government has spent some $2 billion training and equipping the Afghan Air Force, all in hopes here of building up an Afghan security system that will support the Afghan government when U.S. and international troops leave in 2014. But now the U.S. military says they are looking into allegations that there were members of the Afghan Air Force that were using helicopters and airplanes bought by American taxpayers to ferry around drugs and weapons across the country as part of a large drug ring. Now, the U.S. military stresses that these are only allegations and that this is not an official investigation because they say they're just beginning to look into these allegations. These allegations stem from another investigation which happened earlier this year into the shooting of 8 U.S. airmen and 1 U.S. civilian who were shot by Colonel Ahmed Gul, who was an Afghan Air Force pilot. He shot those U.S. and international advisors this summer. The Air Force was looking into that shooting, and these allegations of corruption and drug running stem from that, Martha.
Boy, you know, I can just imagine, Connor, People listening to this story and shaking their heads. The money, the investment of time, the treasure, the personal treasure lost in Afghanistan. What does this tell us, if there's any truth to it, about the Afghan security forces, and what about the rest of them?
Well, Martha, the U.S. government and the international community have been spending billions here trying to build up the Afghan security forces. And as you know, in the last few weeks, there's been a rash of shootings by Afghan security forces, police officers and soldiers shooting U.S. and international troops. This is an endemic problem here across Afghanistan. There is a real lack of trust here in Afghanistan between coalition forces. This only adds to that lack of trust, Martha.
Terrible story and a tough pattern. Connor.
From UFOs to ghost and psychic powers, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now and learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Here are the facts. On December 10, 2004, journalist Gary Webb was found dead with 2 gunshot wounds to his head in Carmichael, California. The coroner ruled the death a suicide, and Webb's ex-wife noted that he had been depressed after a falling out with his employers at the San Jose Mercury. Gary Webb was a controversial but lauded journalist. In 1996, he wrote a series of articles for the Mercury that were later made into a book called Dark Alliance. Prominent newspapers attacked this series, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. Eventually, Webb's own paper backed away from his work. Many believe that being professionally discredited drove him to suicide, and his claims were exaggerated. Yet conspiracy theorists believe Gary Webb was murdered because his story was not only true, but the beginning of an international scandal. So what did he actually write? Here's where it gets crazy. In this series, Webb alleged that Nicaraguan Contras were responsible for the Los Angeles crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s. He also claimed that the CIA knew of these operations and, at the very least, ignored them. At worst, he alleged they actually covered up the crimes. With extensively documented sources, Gary Webb built a case that argued the Contras were able to somehow get cocaine into the U.S. and get cash out much more easily than other drug-running organizations. Without having to pay the cost of transportation, the Contras were able to sell cocaine at bargain basement prices. Webb claimed that this cheap cocaine flooded the market, enabling the crack epidemic. While these allegations were severe, they were not far-fetched. In South and Central America, it's not unusual for revolutionary groups to use the drug trade as a way to raise money. Other groups such as FARC and the Shining Path have both employed similar strategies. Yet why were the Contras able to move their product with such ease? According to Gary Webb, it's because they had the support of the CIA. Webb never claimed that the CIA provided outright assistance to the Contras, but he did claim the CIA had knowledge of this drug trade for some time. Why on earth would an agency of the US government allow criminals to bring drugs into the country? To Webb, it was a matter of realpolitik. The money the Contras generated from the drug trade allowed them to wage war in Nicaragua, attempting to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government. Supporting the Contra army was so important that the CIA also prevented the Department of Justice and the DEA from prosecuting several known Contra smugglers. The Reagan administration had already established a precedent for this behavior by tolerating drug trafficking as long as the trafficking benefited the Contras. Additionally, later CIA investigations partially vindicated Webb's findings. It seemed that Gary Webb was professionally redeemed. So why do conspiracy buffs think he was murdered? According to conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, Webb was assassinated to prevent the publication of a second book, one with even more evidence of criminal activity by the CIA. Some of Webb's acquaintances say that he told them if he was found dead, it would not be a case of suicide. The conspiracy world is rife with questions regarding this death, including debates about the ability to deliver 2 self-inflicted gunshots. This becomes a conspiracy within a conspiracy. To the mainstream, Gary Webb committed suicide because he was blackballed for speaking truth to power, and people who believe he was murdered are only prolonging the pain for Webb's surviving family and friends. Yet to conspiracy theorists, this is an open and shut case of political assassination. This is clearly a situation full of stuff they don't want you to know. But here's the real question. Does our government have secrets worth killing for?
John, could you go into some more detail on this blackmail theme of how Bush might be subject to blackmail because of his involvement in the CIA and in other activities during the Reagan administration? What would be an example of this, and how would such blackmail work?
Well, let's go into the most obvious case that we know of, the one that we have the best documented so far. And this is this Black Eagle thing that was started in '82. Essentially, in a reversal of roles, the CIA is actually created to give the White House and the executive plausible deniability, so they can keep clean, and if the CIA does something wrong, they can, well, we didn't know about it, and they can fire the CIA's director. William Casey reversed this policy, and it was actually quite clever in retrospect in the Iran-Contra thing. He initiated the Iran-Contra thing, but he managed to have Ronald Reagan and the White House take the heat for it. He ran it through Oliver North. So it became a political thing, whereas the CIA was clearly under the thumb of the Congress, or should have been, or legally was. But he also, this Black Eagle operation of delivering arms to the Contras, he got George Bush to front for that, to use the vice president's office to front for that. And Bush was a very activist vice president, running this thing they had on anti-terrorism, supposedly, which is, of course, 1984 doublespeak for, running terrorist activities, smuggling arms. And through that operation, they began to work through Panama, and the planes flying through Panama, and Noriega gave them access to the airstrips that they needed, and immediately began working the other end of the line through the Medellin, using the same Black Eagle planes to fly drugs up here into the United States. And Bush his office was running this thing. Now, obviously, they tried to maintain what I thought was a very thin, implausible deniability of having Don Gregg running the thing right out of George Bush's office with his assistant, what's his name, Samuel Watson, and then Felix Rodriguez down in El Salvador, and then a network that went throughout, planes flying throughout, Southern Air Transport involved, their own airplanes involved, and yet the only deniability was Gregg saying, well, I never told the vice president about all of these things, which is utterly impossible. It is not within the realm of human, unless the person were a Ronald Reagan, and even then he would have had to have known what Gregg was doing.
Can you give us a little background on Gregg, the fact that he and Bush had been together in the CIA and buddies for a long time?
Yeah, Gregg was not an original. I think he came into the CIA in '51, a graduate of Williams College. At the height, that was getting into the McCarthy era, the height of conservatism, the Korean War, a very, very conservative era, and he joined and had what was ultimately a tremendously successful career. In fact, I thought that Bush would wind up appointing him as a CIA director, and instead he's gone with William Webster. The guy had to do with the destabilization of Cuba in the '60s. He wound up in Vietnam in Military Region 3 in 1970, and that's where I was, except I didn't overlap with him. But I got there just after he had left, so there were a lot of people were talking about him and about Felix Rodriguez,
who was one of his favorite operatives in Vietnam.
The height of the Phoenix program.
And Shackley was his boss, wasn't he?
And Shackley was the boss.
So you see the same group moving in with George Bush then in the basement of the White House, right next door to Oliver North.
Minus Shackley.
Shackley wasn't.
Yeah, minus Shackley, who had been squeezed out by then.
But Shackley was still in operation, involved in a lot of these things.
Well, I'm sure the old boy thing worked so that he was in contact with them, but don't ever forget that these people fight a lot. They are as bad as people in the peace movement about squabbling, literally. You remember when Black Eagle eventually fell apart, and then the enterprise kind of came apart. Oliver North and Felix Rodriguez were at each other's throats. And these are two very volatile, unstable, dangerous men who couldn't get along. You remember The incident that's cited in the Foreign Policy Fall 88 issue that broke Black Eagle was when the CIA operatives, it doesn't name them, and the Israeli operatives drew their pistols on each other.
This was 1985.
85. Wow. And they were about to start blasting each other away, and the senior head said, everybody cool it, just, you know, slow down, and prevailed and got everybody to put their guns back. And at the same time, the Pollard case was breaking, and the U.S. was going to prosecute the Pollards, and Israel didn't appreciate that, so it withdrew its support.
Who had been spying for Israel and
against the United States.
Right. And, yeah.
Can you clarify something for me, or are you through with it? What you?
No, there's so much of this material. Yeah.
I'm a bit confused now. Oliver North's office was next door to George Bush and Donald Gregg's in the bottom of the White House, as I understand it. Now, were they working together, or as I've heard some people say, they actually had two separate arms running and drug smuggling operations going? Or were they separate but coordinated?
Well, you know, they have done everything they could to obfuscate, if you will, and confuse the issue. North admitted that he met with Bush on many occasions, but he minimized the cooperation. The way I see it is there were a number of different offices, and people did have different roles to play, and there were different power lines working. And don't ever forget that there is just a norm of every presidency since I've been around anyway, is a lot of intense competitiveness. I mean, people, they're really ruthless. Everybody's jockeying for position endlessly inside the White House and the Vice President's office, if he has any power. So North was definitely part of the same machinery. He was definitely cooperating with George Bush as Bush was cooperating with Casey. But at the same time, North was definitely beating his own drum and tooting his own horn and flying around the world grandstanding and setting his... They were not what, you know, it was not a disciplined unit like one CIA office would be, or one Marine division would be, or one of your Navy ships would be. And these are a lot of competing people who are in the same ideology, the same administration, and moving in the same direction, with the same evil intentions.
The way that the Rolling Stone told this story in their November 3rd essay on the dirty secrets of George Bush, the Black Eagle operation that Bush, Rodriguez, and Gregg were running was coming apart because of this rupture with the Israelis, and also because they found out Noriega was running so many drugs that this was threatening the integrity of the operation. So North began this other enterprise, literally called the Enterprise, with Richard Secord and Hakeem and these people to bring arms down to the Contras. But Secord had trouble getting it off, so that Felix Rodriguez began another operation, and once Secord got his going, they shut down the operation with Rodriguez's Cuban friends, who had lost a lot of money in this and were very angry, and this began the tension between Rodriguez and Bush and the Secord North group, and eventually the tensions there sort of exploded, and Bush was the guy supposedly trying to hold everything together. That when these other guys, North and Rodriguez, were at each other's throats, Bush was the guy that had to smooth things over. So again, he played a major role in carrying out these operations, according at least to these this Rolling Stone story that seemed fairly well documented.
No, I endorse it. The way you describe it is the way I have read it myself very much. That. In fact, the original outfit, they had built this giant warehouse called the Arms Supermarket and stocked it with arms which are supposed to be bought by the Contras with the U.S. taxpayers' dollars or the private enterprise dollars. And at the time that North pulled away from that enterprise to start the Enterprise, they had that thing stocked with $18 million worth of arms. Now, you know, arms is a cash-for business, and this cash had to come from the Medellin Colombian cocaine cartel.
Right.
So there was drug money that they had been working with that had stocked this warehouse, counting on selling the arms to the Enterprise Smalley, and then North did break away at the point where he saw that thing apparently as getting out of control, as being too explosive. Now, it was not. Don't anyone misunderstand that he was morally troubled by working with people who were smuggling drugs. He had known for years these people were smuggling drugs. But as you noted, the volume of it was getting so high that he saw an earthquake coming and actually moved. There also was undoubtedly part of his ego, power play, power struggle at the level of him and Rodriguez, at the level perhaps of him and Gregg.
During this whole time, George Bush was supervisor. He was control of the anti-drug program in the United States, not just the propaganda bit, you know, just say no, but a great and very expensive operation to interdict drugs and to keep them from coming into the United States. So it was a perfect circle, not only from the propaganda point of view, because Bush could be said to be the guy who is keeping it from coming in, but on the covert aspect, he could make sure that this stuff came in undetected.
And yet, none of these stories came out during the election campaign. When I left for Europe on August the 17th, during the Republican convention, Dukakis was 10 or 15 points ahead. Bush had just nominated chosen Quayle as vice president. That looked like it was going to be a self-destruct operation. And when I came back a month later, Bush was 10 points ahead. What do you make of this? How do you analyze Bush's turning things around and winning the presidency? What was involved in this?
Well, one just quick observation is there's some false polling in the summer. After the Democratic convention, the Democrats always look better. They've gotten a lot of publicity. And then a month later, after the Republican convention, they have a surge back. And so it's sometime about the 1st of September where the polls, I think, I forget the figure, but it's something like 9 times out of 10, the one who is leading on the 1st of September wins. So it's stabilized by the end of August. And in fact, by the end of August, Bush was ahead again. The Quayle thing was a heavy hit of Bush. One might call it a major blunder, but since he succeeded, we all reflected on that a lot. His choice of Quayle, as I see it, was twofold. He had to pick someone who would make him look like a giant. And that was not easy to do. If he picked Bob Dole, for example, someone who knew more and had a stronger personality, he would have all kinds of problems. He also, in my opinion, and this is an analyst's opinion, you know, this is not based on any hard quotes or anything, very subjective, but he also had to pick someone who was bought into the Iran-Contra scandal. And Quayle was. He was the senator from Indiana, and Indiana's the state that John Hull, you know, came from, who was the man who had the ranch in Costa Rica from which all the drug smuggling and the arms, you know, from the southern side of the Contra thing had been run. And it turns out, as we dug up in August and found out, this young man working for Quayle introduced Hull to Oliver North originally, and that young man's name was Robert Owens.
And Owens so was involved in all this?
Owens was working for Quayle when he introduced John Hull. Oh yes, when he introduced John Hull to Oliver North and gave them that whole option, which evolved into the enterprise and the whole scandal.
That's incredible. The whole interconnections, all of this, even Quayle. I mean, this is amazing.
To go back, this is a very complicated thing, but I think we can sort it out. I don't think Bush dared to have someone in office who was clean of the Iran-Contra thing, like Dole, who could benefit from an impeachment.
So he needed someone that would be tainted enough with the Iran-Contra that they would be forced to resign at the same time.
They would be impeached with him, who could not possibly benefit from his impeachment. He needed to create a situation
to protect himself,
where the establishment couldn't shunt him aside and put in a strong figure like Dole or Howard Baker, who would be very acceptable to the public and to the establishment.
Right.
And that's where Quayle came. And that Barbara Honegger, who is not the world's greatest analyst, but she certainly has a lot of fire and imagination, and she coined the phrase that Quayle was Bush's impeachment insurance.
So I just want to move on to Europe here for a second. There are several terror events in Europe by Europeans recently. Now, each one of the bad guys was already known to security services. Good example being here in the UK. They had somebody who was on MI5's radar. He went off to join ISIS, and he became the Jihadi John.
Jihadi John, the British ISIS militant identified by Western intelligence as Mohammed Emwazi, terrified Western audiences.
And he became the Jihadi John. So your thoughts, is this because we have too much data or too many people on the terror watch list? There's not enough real intelligence? What's going on here?
Well, Max, this may be too much for you guys, but let me give you the bottom line as I see it. Number one, there is no negotiating with banks. The hell with them. Throw them out of the country, go back to public banking, okay? Period. Number two, most terrorists are false flag terrorists or are created by our own security services.
There was a sacred chord David played and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do ya?
Number two, most terrorists are false flag terrorists or are created by our own security services. Now, I have no direct access in England, but I will tell you that here in the United States, every single terrorist incident we have had has been a false flag or has been an informant pushed on by the FBI. In fact, we now have citizens taking out restraining orders against FBI informants that are trying to incite terrorism. We've become a lunatic asylum. As far as Jihadi John, the best guess that I can give you is that this is funded by Saudi Arabia, trained by CIA. This destruction of ancient artifacts and so on, that's a covert action influence operation. That's not something they would normally do. This is, in one word, largely theater.
Western audiences.
All right, Robert, let me jump in and digress slightly, because on one hand, you're pointing out what you call harsh truths. On the other hand, you're offering up what you believe to be part of the solution. And this would get back to the open source everything manifesto. Am I correct in saying that one way to combat what you're calling false flag operations and a lot of insider skullduggery is to go open source? In other words, take all this data and make it public. So what's your view on like an Edward Snowden or Julian Assange? I mean, they have worked to open things up in a very public way. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's a good thing. But again, Max, I mean, you're one of the most sophisticated guys I talk to, and your listeners are among the most intelligent. Everything is nuanced. I mean, take Assange, for example. Assange was a good thing, but he also had Mossad connections. Snowden is a good thing, but right now all indications are that he's a CIA op that was authorized by Obama to take NSA down a notch. And the reason that the State Department canceled his passport while he was en route to Russia was precisely to throw him in front of the Russians as a dangle. So all of this stuff is complicated.